Hey Zoology, this is Unit 2. We are in our second unit starting our animals with the simplest ones, phyla of Porifera, Cnidaria, and Ctenophora, and we are now talking about the Cnidarians today. All right. So you did your reading to kind of introduce yourself a little bit to them, and now we're going to dive a little deeper. So what are Cnidarians? Here are the general characteristics. They are soft bodies, so these are the jellies. Anything that's jelly-like or gelatinous falls into the Cnidarians more than likely. They are aquatic. Most of them are marine, meaning marine means saltwater, so most of them are found in the oceans, whereas some of them are freshwater, and we'll talk about one of those. They all have radial symmetry. They're carnivorous, so all of these animals are heterotrophic, and they do have to eat other living beings. Most of them do consume other animals. They're diploblastic, so they only have two germ layers. They have their ectoderm and their endoderm. So Cnidarians, when they had their gastrula, the blastopore folds in, and then they end up with the ectoderm, and in here is the endoderm. Well, that's kind of where they stop. So they actually don't even have a complete digestive tract. They kind of just stop with that. So they essentially all have kind of a body style like that. Ugh, that's ugly. But you get the idea, okay? So they have a outside flesh, if you will. They have an inside lining to their digestive cavity or their gastrointestinal cavity. Gastrovascular cavity, excuse me. And they just have that one opening on the bottom. So they also, like I mentioned, have an incomplete gut. So their mouth and anus is the same opening. They just have one opening. Sometimes it's on the bottom of the organism. Sometimes it's on the top of the organism. But a jellyfish and a sea anemone are essentially the same thing, just flips upside down. They have a mouth. They have a cavity inside. They have tentacles around their mouth. And that's how they consume. They have no coelom. So these are organisms that, because they don't have a mesoderm, they don't have any sort of body cavity. They have no coelom. They have a very primitive nervous system called a nerve net. All Cnidarians share one major common characteristic, stinging cells called nematocysts. And Cnidarian comes from the Greek word knidos, which means stinging nettles. So they have always been named because every single one of them has those stinging cells called nematocysts. So Cnidarian bodies are organized around their GVC, or their gastrovascular cavity. So gastro means digestive, vascular is like respiratory. So the GVC is really their one cavity where everything happens. That's where they exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide, because even though they might be unique, they get energy through cellular respiration. So they exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen within the gastrovascular cavity. They also can break down food in the gastrovascular cavity. So it's really just this kind of huge open cavity with one opening up to, in an anemone, it's up into the water column. For a jellyfish, it's down into the water column, but either way. They have two layers, something called the gastrodermis, aka the endoderm. So it's essentially the lining of the gastrovascular cavity. And then they have their epidermis, or their ectoderm. So the ectoderm in most animals turns into what we call the epidermis, aka its skin. Jellyfish don't have a coelom, but they do have this weird textured substance that they secrete and they create between their gastrodermis and their epidermis, so between their internal cavity and their outside skin. And it's called mesoglia, and it's kind of like a very firm jelly. And that's just kind of what provides support for them. So Cnidarians exhibit two body forms. They either are in the polyp form or the medusa form. So the polyp form is the form where it's attached to the bottom and sessile. Sessile means it's not moving around anymore. Now, we saw early in the semester that they can detach and kind of violently move around from time to time, but overall they're not moving. And their mouth faces up with tentacles around it. The medusa is free moving, free swimming, able to move around. Now, most of them are not able to actually choose the direction they want to go in. They're kind of referred to as planktonic animals. Being part of the plankton means you just kind of move with the current. So jellyfish don't usually get to decide which direction they go, although we'll talk about some that do. But they are able to move around, and they have a mouth that faces down with the tentacles hanging around it. So again, Both of them are identical in their overall design. They have a mouth, which is also their anus, that is opening to their gastrovascular cavity, lined by their gastrodermis or their endoderm. They have tentacles around their mouth, and on their outside, they are surrounded by the ectoderm or the epidermis. And they use their gastrovascular cavity for food and for, chemical exchange. So oxygen, carbon dioxide, and food. So the other big classifying thing about cnidarians is what's on their tentacles. So they use their tentacles to stun and tangle their prey, and then they grab it and pull it and put it into their mouth with their tentacle usually. But their tentacles are composed of cells called cnidocytes. And you can see cnido, like cnidarian, this is something unique to only them. Only they have these cnidocytes. They contain the nematocys. Now, the nematocys is essentially a harpoon. So over here, this is the nematocyst. So we see that it is essentially kind of a sharp harpoon, and it has a thread on it. It also has a poison gland inside of it, so it can actually secrete the venom or secrete the poison. And the nematocysts are triggered by the cnidocyl. So here it's called the trigger, but we're beyond that. We can call it what it is, the cnidocyl. So again, cnidocyte, cnidocyl, these are things very unique to the cnidarians. Only they have these. So the trigger kind of starts it, and that causes the nematocyst to trigger into the animal, and then it injects the venom and goes from there. This is a video I'm going to be showing you guys in class so that we don't go over time on this particular video. The second thing that cnidarians have is they do have a nervous system of sorts. They have a nerve net, so they're able to use electrical currents within their body to cause contractions. So they can use that electrical current to close in their tentacles, or they can use it to contract their entire body at once and cause that movement in the water column. Reproduction, so cnidarians can undergo sexual reproduction. And they secrete their gametes usually directly into the water, so they have to be nearby other cnidarians of that sort. Corals are like this. They undergo sexual reproduction. So they release their sperm and egg into the water column. They kind of mix together, and when corals are spawning, of course, fish from all over come because there is a lot of food, and so they eat it. They also can undergo asexual reproduction. We'll talk about that process, but usually it's through the process called budding, where it essentially just starts growing another one of itself off the side. So some cnidarians undergo this process called alternation of generations. So what that means is that they alternate between being a polyp and then being a medusa. And the polyps reproduce asexually through budding, and then they can, or through strobilation, which we'll talk about in a second, and then they can go off and become medusa in the water column. Then they can reproduce sexually as well. And so they create zygotes that are free swimming called planula larvae. Just know that they're called larvae. But alternation of generations means that some cnidarians can actually switch back and forth. So we see here that starting with a polyp can undergo this process of either budding or strobilation. Strobilation means that they essentially just start breaking their body column down into segments that then can pop off and turn into the medusa form of the cnidarian, which is kind of the jellyfish form, so to speak. Jellyfish or medusa can actually undergo sexual reproduction. Then they create larvae that then settle and recreate polyps and then go like that. So these organisms can have this life cycle where it just continues to go around, and they're polyps when they're babies, they're medusa when they're adults, polyps when they're babies, medusa when they're adults, etc. And so, like I said, strobilation is kind of a unique one because some polyps will just undergo budding. They just break off on the side. They create another baby of themselves, and that's it. But strobilation is interesting where they multiply their body in segments, and then they break off those segments, and they become medusa. And so that is a process called strobilation, and it is very common in class Scyphozoa, which we'll talk about in a second. So again, here we have these options. So you can go through the entire process, or within the polyps alone, you can undergo asexual or sexual, or within the medusa, you can undergo asexual or sexual. So cnidarians really can reproduce in a lot of different ways. They can alternate through generations, going polyp medusa. They can be a polyp their whole life and be asexual or sexual. They can be a medusa for almost all of their life and undergo asexual or sexual. So phylum Cnidaria is broken down into 4 classes: Hydrozoa, zoa meaning animal, Scyphozoa, Cubozoa, and Anthozoa. So class Hydrozoa, these are small predatory animals. Here we have a picture of a Portuguese man-o-war, a hydra, and a fire coral, which is not a real coral. Most hydrozoans do alternate generations. Make sure you make a note of that, because that is a big way that we can classify some of them. Most hydrozoans do have a polyp and medusa stage, so they alternate generations. Many of them are colonial. They live in groups. So the Portuguese man-o-war is a colony of hydrozoans, so is a fire coral. Some are sessile and branching. Others form massive colonies. Some of them, like the man-o-war, do have very large floating colonies. In fact, these siphonophores are one of the largest animals on Earth because they can form colonies that are 80, 90 feet long, but they're just jellies stuck together floating in the water column. So hydrozoas are mostly colonial, and they do alternate generations. Scyphozoa, these are the jellyfish. They do have a polyp and a medusa stage, but it is important to note that they do remain, in most of their life is in the medusa stage. That is the dominant form. They can be very small, all the way up to massive ones like this one. So there can be extremely large jellyfish that exist. That just means they're very old usually. The long dangling tentacles ensnare the prey, and then they pull them up into the mouth. Sea turtles eat a lot of these, but we don't, because they really don't have a lot of nutritional value, so they're just not great. Sea turtles actually, strangely, can, and a lot of other animals too, can eat jellyfish, and then they kind of hijack their dermatocysts and put them in different parts of their body. They're weird. Class Cubozoa, these are the scary ones. So they are cube-shaped, they have a medusa stage, and they may have a unique polyp stage, but usually they're just going to be medusas. They're very fast, and they actually have eye spots. On here you can see them, they're dark, so they can tell where light is, so they can kind of follow prey, and they can figure out where the surface is, where the bottom is, etc. They're usually extremely small, but they're highly venomous, and in fact, some of them, just one sting can kill a human. And then the last class is class Anthozoa. Anthozoa are the corals, the sea anemones. Those are kind of the two big examples, corals and sea anemones. They have no medusa stage. They live their entire life on the bottom unless they're a larvae. So they have no bell-shaped medusa stage at all. Many of them do create calcium carbonate structures that they live on top of. So they create these kind of rock-like structures that they grow on top of. Or the sea anemones just kind of take their bottom, they secrete kind of a glue and glue themselves to a surface that they're on. So the 4 main classes again: Hydrozoa, Anthozoa, Cubozoa, and Scyphozoa. All right, I will talk to you guys in class next time.